The Beckett family of Elmwood Hills, Colorado, appeared to have it all. Andrew Beckett was a respected dentist whose calm demeanor and steady hands made him a favorite in the small-town community. His wife, Maggie Beckett, was the kind of elementary school teacher parents requested for their children, warm, patient, and dedicated. Together, they raised their only child, Caleb, a charismatic 17-year-old whose talents seemed boundless. To their neighbors, the Becketts embodied the American dream: successful careers, a close-knit family, and an active presence in community events. Andrew often volunteered at free dental clinics, while Maggie organized bake sales and charity drives at the school. Caleb, meanwhile, excelled in sports and academics, becoming the town's pride. People often remarked how lucky Caleb was to have such loving, devoted parents. Little did anyone suspect the fragile foundation of their seemingly perfect life, a foundation resting on a carefully concealed secret. Caleb Beckett's childhood was idyllic, a series of sunlit memories painted with the warmth of parental love. Andrew taught him to build model planes in their garage, his steady voice guiding Caleb's small hands with precision. Maggie, the creative heart of the family, would transform bedtime into theatrical performances, using different voices for each character in his favorite stories. Summers were spent at the local pool, where Caleb quickly became the strongest swimmer in his age group, and winters brought snowball fights and hot chocolate by the fireplace. The Beckett home was alive with laughter and the subtle chaos of raising a curious, active child. Caleb's preschool teachers praised his sharp mind and eagerness to learn. By the time he reached elementary school, he had developed a reputation as the boy who could excel at everything, whether it was acing a spelling test or scoring the winning goal in a soccer game. Andrew and Maggie couldn't have been prouder, their hearts swelling with love every time Caleb reached a new milestone. But beneath the joy and pride lay a secret that neither Andrew nor Maggie dared to reveal: Caleb was not their biological son. Born on a stormy night in May 2004 at Silver Creek General Hospital in Denver, Colorado, Caleb had entered the world under difficult circumstances. His biological mother, Grace Holden, was a young woman struggling with poverty and family instability. Realizing she couldn't provide the life her child deserved, Grace made the heartbreaking decision to place Caleb for adoption. Andrew and Maggie, who had battled infertility for years, saw Caleb's adoption as a miracle, a chance to fulfill their dreams of parenthood. From the moment they first held him, they vowed to give Caleb all the love and opportunities he deserved. They chose not to disclose his adoption during his early years, reasoning that he was too young to understand. Over time, the decision became more complicated. Each passing year made it harder to find the right moment to tell Caleb the truth. And so, the secret remained, buried beneath the surface of their happy family life like a dormant volcano. By the time Caleb reached high school, the first cracks in this carefully constructed reality began to show. Tall, athletic, and undeniably handsome, Caleb seemed destined for success. He joined the varsity soccer team as a freshman and excelled in classes like biology and psychology, subjects that fascinated his inquisitive mind. Yet, beneath his confident exterior, Caleb was struggling with feelings he couldn't fully articulate. He began noticing subtle differences between himself and his parents, their mannerisms, their interests, even their physical traits. Andrew's quiet intensity and Maggie's artistic warmth didn't seem to match Caleb's fiery determination and analytical mind. These differences, while minor, planted seeds of doubt that slowly grew in the back of Caleb's mind. His once open nature began to shift. Conversations at the dinner table became shorter, more strained. When Andrew or Maggie asked about his day, Caleb often responded with vague answers or shrugged off their questions entirely. He retreated to his room more often, his earbuds in, shutting out the world. It wasn't rebellion, it was confusion, a sense that something was off, though he couldn't pinpoint what. Andrew and Maggie attributed Caleb's behavior to normal teenage development. "He's just finding his independence," Maggie would say, though a flicker of worry crossed her face each time Caleb gave her a curt response. Andrew, ever the pragmatist, suggested giving Caleb space. "He'll come around," he assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced. As Caleb's 18th birthday approached, the tension in the Beckett household grew palpable. Caleb's questions about family history became more direct. "What was Grandpa like when he was my age?" he asked one evening, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Maggie hesitated, fumbling for an answer about her father, who had passed away before Caleb was born. The pause wasn't lost on Caleb, who pressed further, his questions growing sharper with each deflection. In his heart, Caleb didn't want to believe his parents were hiding something. But the unanswered questions and fragmented family stories left him with a gnawing suspicion. A sense of betrayal began to simmer, one he couldn't yet name but could feel growing stronger with each passing day. Unbeknownst to the Becketts, their carefully kept secret was about to come crashing down, shattering the illusion of their perfect family and setting in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. Caleb's curiosity had been ignited, and his relentless search for answers would soon lead him to a discovery that no one could have anticipated, a revelation that would unravel the very fabric of his existence. As the crisp September air settled over Elmwood Hills, the Beckett household was anything but serene. Caleb's 18th birthday loomed on the horizon, and while Maggie and Andrew busied themselves with party preparations, their son grew increasingly distant. What should have been a joyous milestone for the family felt like walking on a fraying tightrope, the tension mounting with each passing day. Caleb couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something about his life didn't add up. The suspicions had been building for months, sparked by inconsistencies in the stories his parents told about their past. Maggie often painted vivid pictures of her childhood, playing with her siblings, helping her mother bake, and attending school plays. But when Caleb asked about his own infancy, her answers were far less detailed. "You were such an easy baby," she'd say, brushing past his questions about their early days as a family. Andrew, ever the logical one, seemed better at deflecting Caleb's questions, offering practical but hollow explanations that did little to quell his doubts. Once, when Caleb asked why there were no baby pictures of him at home, Andrew casually replied, "We didn't take many back then, too busy chasing after you." Caleb accepted the answer at the time, but as the doubts gnawed at him, he began to revisit every interaction with a critical lens. Adding fuel to Caleb's unease was the growing realization that he looked nothing like his parents. His lean, athletic frame and dark hair contrasted sharply with Andrew's broader build and Maggie's warm blonde curls. While his friends would casually joke about how they were spitting images of their parents, Caleb found himself unable to join the conversation. The gap between who he thought he was and the reality he was beginning to suspect widened with every unanswered question. On the morning of September 16, 2022, the day before his birthday, Caleb decided he'd had enough. He'd been meaning to locate his birth certificate for a college application but kept putting it off, dreading the potential confrontation with his parents. That morning, however, his resolve hardened. With Maggie at work and Andrew out running errands, Caleb saw his chance. He started in the home office, a tidy space Andrew kept meticulously organized. Caleb rifled through the desk drawers, his heart pounding with each creak of the wood. Folders labeled taxes, insurance, and medical records were stacked neatly in alphabetical order, but nothing related to his birth. Then, at the bottom of the filing cabinet, he spotted a manila folder labeled Caleb, Important Documents. The sight of his name written in Andrew's precise handwriting sent a jolt through him. With trembling hands, Caleb pulled the folder out and placed it on the desk. Inside, he found what he thought was his birth certificate, but the words at the top of the document made his stomach drop, Certificate of Adoption. His name, Caleb Beckett, was there in bold letters, but so was another name that sent his mind spinning, Grace Holden. A rush of panic swept over him as he flipped through the other papers in the folder. Medical records from his infancy, letters from an adoption agency, and a photograph of a young woman he didn't recognize. Her dark hair and striking blue eyes mirrored his own. She was smiling softly, her gaze filled with a mix of hope and sadness. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, were the words, "For Caleb, with love, Grace." The walls of the office seemed to close in around him. Caleb clutched the papers to his chest and stumbled into the living room, where he spread the contents of the folder across the coffee table. The life he thought he'd known felt like a fragile house of cards, now collapsing under the weight of a single revelation. His parents, Andrew and Maggie, the people who had raised him, loved him, and shaped him, were not his biological parents. By the time Maggie returned home that evening, Caleb was waiting for her in the living room, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The adoption papers were spread out on the table in front of him, an unspoken accusation. Maggie froze in the doorway, her shopping bags slipping from her hands. "What's this?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling with anger. He didn't call her Mom. Maggie's face turned pale as she registered what Caleb had found. "Caleb, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off, his voice rising. "Explain what? That my whole life has been a lie? That you've been hiding this from me for 18 years? Andrew walked in moments later, drawn by the commotion, and immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. He moved to stand beside Maggie, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. "Son, we were going to tell you," Andrew said carefully, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "We just didn't know how or when." "You didn't know how?" Caleb spat, his anger bubbling over. "You've had 18 years to figure it out. What else haven't you told me? Who is Grace Holden, and why did you think I didn't deserve to know where I came from?" Maggie stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "We did it because we love you, Caleb," she pleaded. "We didn't want you to feel different, to feel like you didn't belong." Caleb's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Belong?" he echoed. "How could I ever belong when you've kept the truth from me my entire life?" The argument dragged on into the night, growing louder and more volatile with each passing minute. Andrew tried to mediate, but his attempts to reason with Caleb only stoked the fire of his resentment. Maggie's apologies, heartfelt as they were, fell on deaf ears. Caleb's anger was too raw, his sense of betrayal too overwhelming. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating tension any longer, Caleb stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Maggie collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably, while Andrew stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists. Outside, Caleb walked aimlessly under the dim glow of the streetlights, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. The life he thought he'd known had been irreparably shattered, and he had no idea how to pick up the pieces. As Caleb disappeared into the night, the Becketts were left to grapple with the consequences of their long-held secret, unaware that the storm brewing inside their son would soon erupt into unimaginable tragedy. The early morning hours of Caleb Beckett's 18th birthday were cloaked in an eerie stillness, as if the universe itself braced for the inevitable fallout. Inside the Beckett household, the tension was suffocating. Maggie hadn't slept, her mind replaying the previous night's argument on an endless loop. Andrew sat silently at the kitchen table, his hands cradling a cold cup of coffee, his usually calm demeanor fractured by worry. But Caleb was nowhere to be found. Caleb had spent the night wandering the quiet streets of Elmwood Hills, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. He'd ended up at Willow Creek Lake, a place that had always been a source of peace for him. But this time, the lake's tranquil waters offered no solace. Instead, they reflected the storm raging inside him, a storm of betrayal, confusion, and anger that he couldn't contain. He stared at the crumpled photograph of Grace Holden, the woman whose eyes mirrored his own, as he sat on the shore. For hours, Caleb grappled with questions that had no easy answers. Who was Grace? Did she ever think about him? And how could Andrew and Maggie, the people he had trusted most in the world, have lied to him for so long? As dawn broke, Caleb's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his parents, alternating between apologies and desperate pleas for him to come home. Maggie's final text, "No matter what, you are and always will be our son. We love you more than anything," sent a surge of conflicting emotions through him. Her words felt like a dagger, a reminder of the love he had once cherished but now questioned. Caleb's mind teetered on the edge, his thoughts darkening with each passing minute. By the time he decided to return home, it wasn't reconciliation he sought. It was answers that he intended to demand, no matter the cost. When Caleb entered the Beckett home that morning, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Maggie rushed toward him, her eyes red and swollen from a sleepless night of crying. "Caleb," she breathed, relief flooding her voice. She reached for him, but he stepped back, his cold expression halting her in her tracks. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice heavy with anger. "We're not going to pretend everything's okay. I need the truth, and I need it now." Andrew rose from his seat, his face lined with exhaustion. "We told you the truth, Caleb. We were going to tell you, but we wanted to wait until you were ready to understand. Don't lie to me again." Caleb's voice cracked, the pain beneath his anger breaking through. 18 years. You had 18 years to tell me, and you didn't. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To realize your whole life has been a lie." Maggie took a step closer, her voice trembling. "It wasn't a lie, Caleb. Everything we did because we love you. We wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Caleb demanded, his voice rising. "From knowing where I come from? From knowing that the woman in this photo," he held up Grace's picture, his hands shaking, "is my real mother?" Andrew's jaw tightened as he tried to maintain his composure. "Grace made the decision to give you up because she wanted you to have a better life. We were the ones who gave you that life." Caleb's laugh was bitter, almost unrecognizable. "A better life? A better life built on lies? You think that makes it okay?" Maggie, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, burst into tears. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Caleb," she sobbed. "We were scared. Scared that if we told you the truth, you'd feel like you didn't belong, like you weren't really ours." Caleb stared at her, his expression softening for a brief moment before the weight of his anger returned. "And now I don't belong anywhere. Not with you. Not with her. I don't even know who I am anymore." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow, and she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Andrew moved to comfort her, but his own grief and frustration were evident. "Caleb," he said, his voice low but steady, "you may not understand it now, but everything we did out of love." "Love?" Caleb shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You don't lie to someone you love. You don't keep something like this from them." The argument reached its peak when Caleb turned his attention to the adoption documents still spread across the coffee table. He picked up the letter Maggie had written to Grace, his hands trembling as he read aloud the words that had never been sent. "Dear Grace, we wanted you to know that Caleb is thriving. He's smart, kind, and everything you hoped he would be. But we also wanted to let you know that he doesn't know about you yet. We're waiting for the right time to tell him." Caleb's voice cracked as he finished reading. "You knew she existed. You knew she was out there, and you still kept her from me." Maggie tried to speak, but Caleb silenced her with a look. "I don't want to hear any more excuses. I just want the truth. Did you ever think about what this would do to me?" Andrew stepped forward, his voice firm. "Yes, we thought about it every day. And we made the best decision we could with the information we had. You don't have to forgive us, Caleb, but you do have to understand that we only ever wanted what was best for you." Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What was best for me," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, with a final look of betrayal, he turned and walked out the door. The door slammed shut behind Caleb, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. Maggie broke down completely, her sobs filling the silence. Andrew stood frozen, his hands gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white. Outside, Caleb stormed down the street, his mind racing. He felt like a stranger in his own life, untethered and lost. The people he had trusted most had betrayed him, and the rage bubbling inside him was now a force he couldn't control. As he disappeared into the distance, the Becketts were left to pick up the pieces of a family torn apart by the weight of their long-held secret, unaware that the storm brewing within Caleb was far from over. Caleb's departure was not an escape, it was the beginning of a dangerous spiral. The truth he had uncovered was a wound that wouldn't heal, and the choices he would make in the coming hours would forever change the lives of everyone he loved. The morning of Caleb Beckett's 18th birthday broke over Elmwood Hills with an overcast sky. The autumn air was heavy, mirroring the storm that had been brewing within Caleb since the discovery of his adoption. For Andrew and Maggie, the silence in the house was deafening. They hadn't heard from Caleb since his dramatic departure the previous night, and every passing hour deepened their worry. What they didn't know was that Caleb was making his way back home, with a plan that would shatter their world. After hours of wandering aimlessly, Caleb found himself standing outside the Beckett family home. He stared at the familiar windows and the porch swing where he'd spent countless summer evenings, feeling like an outsider looking in. The place that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed alien, a facade hiding the lies he could no longer ignore. But Caleb wasn't returning for reconciliation. In his pocket, he carried the combination to Andrew's gun safe, a series of numbers seared into his memory from years of overhearing his father, 051704. His own birth date. The irony stung, but it also fueled his resolve. Entering the house quietly through the back door, Caleb moved with a grim determination. The kitchen was empty, a half-drunk cup of coffee and an untouched plate of toast still sitting on the counter. He made his way to Andrew's home office, his heart pounding in his chest. Each step felt surreal, as if he were watching himself from the outside. Opening the safe, he retrieved the handgun his father kept for home protection. The cold metal felt heavy in his hands, a physical manifestation of the storm raging within him. As he gripped the weapon, Caleb's mind raced. Part of him begged to stop, to put the gun back and leave. But the other part, the part consumed by anger and betrayal, pushed him forward. "They lied to me," he muttered under his breath. "They took everything from me." Andrew and Maggie were sitting in the living room when Caleb appeared in the doorway, the gun clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Andrew slowly stood, his expression a mixture of shock and dread. "Caleb," Andrew began cautiously, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Put the gun down. We can talk about this." Caleb's face twisted with anger. "Talk? You want to talk now?" His voice was raw, each word laced with pain. "After everything? After the lies? You don't get to talk." "Caleb, please," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking. She took a step toward him, but he pointed the gun at her, and she froze. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded, "We love you. We're so sorry. Just put the gun down, and we can make this right." "Make this right?" Caleb spat, his voice rising. "You think you can fix this? You think you can undo 18 years of lies with a few apologies?" Andrew took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on Caleb's. "Son, I know you're hurt. I know you're angry. But this isn't the way. You're better than this. Don't call me that." Caleb shouted, his grip tightening on the gun. "I'm not your son. I never was." The tension in the room was suffocating. Maggie's sobs filled the silence as Andrew tried desperately to defuse the situation. "Caleb," he said softly, "you are our son. It doesn't matter where you came from. What matters is that we love you, and we always have." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Caleb's eyes, hesitation, doubt. But the weight of his pain and betrayal was too much to bear. "Love," he said, his voice shaking. "If you loved me, you would have told me the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath as Caleb raised the gun, aiming it at Andrew. "You took my life from me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now I'm taking yours." Andrew's eyes widened in horror, and before he could respond, the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the house like a thunderclap. Andrew crumpled to the floor, a red stain blossoming across his chest. "No!" Maggie screamed, rushing toward her husband. But Caleb turned the gun on her before she could reach him. "Don't," she begged, her hands trembling. "Please, Caleb. Please." For a moment, it seemed as though Caleb might lower the weapon. But the storm within him had reached its peak. The second shot shattered the air, and Maggie collapsed beside Andrew, her outstretched hand falling just short of his. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stood frozen, the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He stared at the lifeless bodies of the only parents he had ever known, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. A framed family photo lay shattered on the floor, knocked over in Maggie's fall. Caleb's eyes were drawn to the image, a snapshot of a summer vacation years ago, all three of them smiling brightly at the camera. The memory of that day flashed through his mind, Andrew teaching him to skip rocks on the lake, Maggie laughing as Caleb splashed her with water. For a moment, he could almost hear their voices, feel their love. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. In his quest for vengeance, he had destroyed the very thing he had been searching for, his family. The gun slipped from Caleb's hands, clattering to the floor. He sank to his knees, sobs racking his body as the full weight of his actions crushed him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The wail of sirens grew louder in the distance, cutting through the suffocating silence. The neighbors, drawn by the gunshots, had already called the police. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as officers swarmed the house, their voices barking orders to secure the scene. When the police entered, they found Caleb kneeling in the living room, his hands covered in blood. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him, his vacant eyes fixed on the broken family photo. As the officers led Caleb away, the once idyllic Beckett home stood as a silent testament to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, a tragedy born of love, lies, and the devastating power of betrayal. The sirens faded into the distance as Caleb was driven away, leaving behind a family destroyed and a community in shock. But the story of what led to this unthinkable act, and the secrets that still lay buried, was far from over. The tranquility of Elmwood Hills was shattered in the aftermath of the Beckett tragedy. News of the double homicide spread like wildfire, leaving the small town reeling with shock and confusion. How could Caleb Beckett, the bright, promising teenager everyone admired, have committed such a horrific act? The answers lay buried in the wreckage of the Beckett home and in the depths of Caleb's shattered psyche. When Detective Emma Reyes, a seasoned investigator with the Elmwood Hills Police Department, arrived at the scene, she immediately sensed that this case was far from ordinary. The living room told a grim story. Andrew and Maggie Beckett lay lifeless on the floor, their blood pooling beneath them, while Caleb's trembling figure had been led away by officers moments earlier. Reyes scanned the room with a practiced eye, noting the shattered family photo on the floor, the adoption documents strewn across the coffee table, and the safe in Andrew's office that had been left ajar. It was clear that the events of the previous night were the culmination of something far deeper than a typical family dispute. "Start processing the scene," Reyes instructed her team. "We're going to need every detail." At the police station, Caleb sat in the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, his head bowed, hands cuffed in front of him. Detective Reyes entered the room slowly, setting down a folder of crime scene photos on the table between them. "Caleb," she began gently, her voice measured. "I'm Detective Reyes. Can you tell me what happened last night?" For a long moment, Caleb didn't respond. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I killed them," he said. "I killed my parents." Reyes leaned forward, keeping her tone calm but firm. "Why, Caleb? What happened that made you do this?" Caleb shook his head, his voice trembling. "They lied to me. My whole life, it was all a lie." Reyes pressed further, carefully piecing together fragments of Caleb's story. He spoke of finding the adoption papers, of feeling betrayed and lost, and of the argument that escalated into tragedy. But it wasn't until Reyes reviewed the evidence from the Beckett home that she began to understand the full scope of what had driven Caleb to the breaking point. Back at the crime scene, the forensic team uncovered critical pieces of evidence. Among them were the adoption documents Caleb had discovered, including a letter written by Maggie to Grace Holden, his biological mother. Though unsent, the letter painted a picture of a family that had struggled with the weight of their secret for years. The letter read, "Dear Grace, we wanted you to know that Caleb is thriving. He's smart, kind, and everything you hoped he would be. But we haven't told him about you yet. We're afraid of what it might do to him, and to us. Please know that we think of you often and are grateful every day for the gift you gave us." For Reyes, the letter was a revelation. It spoke to the love and fear that had driven Andrew and Maggie's decision to keep Caleb's adoption a secret, a decision that had ultimately led to their deaths. Additionally, a search of Andrew's office revealed recent correspondence with a private investigator. It appeared the Becketts had been trying to locate Grace Holden, perhaps in preparation for finally telling Caleb the truth. This discovery added another layer of tragedy. They had been on the verge of revealing everything, only for their efforts to come too late. To build a comprehensive understanding of the case, Reyes brought in Dr. Victoria Lynn, a renowned forensic psychologist. Over several sessions with Caleb, Dr. Lynn delved into the emotional and psychological turmoil that had led to the murders. Caleb experienced what we call an identity crisis, Dr. Lynn explained to Reyes. Discovering his adoption so suddenly, and in such a confrontational way, fractured his sense of self. He felt betrayed by the two people he trusted most, which triggered a psychological break. Dr. Lynn also identified signs of acute stress disorder, noting that Caleb's actions were driven by overwhelming emotions rather than premeditated intent. This wasn't about hatred, she concluded. It was about pain, unimaginable, consuming pain. The investigation took a significant turn when Reyes tracked down Grace Holden, Caleb's biological mother. Now living in a quiet suburb of Denver, Grace had rebuilt her life after the difficult decision to give Caleb up for adoption. When Reyes arrived at her modest home and explained the situation, Grace was overcome with emotion. Through tears, Grace recounted her reasons for placing Caleb with the Becketts. "I was 19, barely surviving. I wanted him to have a life I couldn't give him, a life with love, stability, everything I didn't have." She expressed deep regret for not being part of Caleb's life, but she also conveyed gratitude for the Becketts, who she believed had given him the life she couldn't provide. Grace agreed to testify, hoping her words might provide clarity, not only for the court, but for Caleb himself. As details of the case emerged, Elmwood Hills struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect Beckett family with the horrifying events that had transpired. Neighbors whispered about the dangers of secrets, while others defended the Beckett's decision, arguing that they had acted out of love. Media coverage of the case was relentless, with headlines labeling Caleb as both a victim of his circumstances and a cold-blooded killer. The debate over whether Caleb's actions were the result of trauma or calculated violence polarized the town and the nation. By the time the investigation concluded, Detective Reyes had pieced together a narrative that was both heartbreaking and maddeningly complex. The Becketts had acted out of love but had underestimated the consequences of their secrecy. Caleb, overwhelmed by betrayal and confusion, had lashed out in a moment of unthinkable rage. And Grace, The woman whose absence had unknowingly shaped so much of Caleb's life, was left to grapple with the guilt of a choice made decades earlier. As the case moved toward trial, the question remained, would the court see Caleb as a broken young man driven to the edge by years of suppressed truth, or as a murderer who had robbed two loving parents of their lives? The truth was clear to Detective Reyes, but would it be enough to save Caleb from the weight of his actions? The trial of Caleb Beckett began on a frigid morning in February 2023. The courthouse in Colorado Springs was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the Elmwood Hills community, all eager to witness the outcome of a case that had captivated the nation. Outside, protesters and supporters clashed, some calling for justice for Andrew and Maggie Beckett, while others advocated for understanding Caleb's actions in the context of his emotional breakdown. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Landry, painted Caleb as a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed the parents who had given him everything. In her opening statement, Landry emphasized the Beckett's reputation as loving, devoted parents and argued that Caleb's actions were a deliberate act of violence, not the result of a psychological breakdown. In contrast, Caleb's defense attorney, Jonathan Marks, portrayed his client as a young man whose world had been shattered by a revelation he was unprepared to handle. Marks presented evidence of Caleb's psychological state, including testimony from Dr. Victoria Lynn, who described Caleb's acute stress reaction and dissociative state at the time of the murders. The turning point of the trial came when Grace Holden, Caleb's biological mother, took the stand. Her emotional testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. She described the pain of giving up her son, her gratitude to the Becketts for providing him with a loving home, and her regret that her decision had inadvertently contributed to the tragedy. "Caleb isn't a monster," Grace said, her voice trembling. "He's a boy who was overwhelmed by feelings he couldn't control. If anyone is to blame, it's me, for not being there when he needed me most." After 3 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Caleb Beckett was found not guilty of first-degree murder by reason of insanity. The decision was polarizing. Supporters of Caleb saw it as a recognition of the emotional and psychological toll of long-buried secrets, while critics decried it as a miscarriage of justice. Judge Eleanor Blackwell ordered Caleb to be committed to a high-security psychiatric facility for an indeterminate period, pending regular evaluations to determine his mental state and potential threat to society. As the gavel fell, the weight of the tragedy hung heavily over the courtroom. For Caleb, the verdict brought little solace. The facility where he was sent was a far cry from the home he had destroyed, its sterile walls a constant reminder of the life he had lost. Therapy sessions with Dr. Lynn became a lifeline, as Caleb slowly began to unpack the layers of anger, betrayal, and grief that had consumed him. Grace Holden visited Caleb regularly, forging a tentative bond that both longed for but struggled to navigate. Their conversations were a mix of apologies, shared pain, and the beginnings of understanding. "You're not alone anymore," Grace told him one day. "We'll figure this out together." Meanwhile, the Elmwood Hills community grappled with the tragedy in its own way. The Beckett home, once a symbol of perfection, stood empty, a haunting reminder of the lives lost within its walls. Neighbors who had once admired the family now debated the dangers of keeping secrets, the impact of identity, and the delicate balance of love and truth. Over time, Caleb's story became more than just a tale of tragedy, it became a cautionary tale. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the importance of addressing identity crises and the emotional toll of secrecy within families. Legal scholars dissected the trial as an example of the intersection between mental health and criminal justice. For Caleb, the journey toward healing was long and arduous. He wrote letters to his parents, though he knew they would never be read, pouring out his remorse and longing for their forgiveness. "I hope you can see me now," he wrote in one letter. "I hope you know how sorry I am. I'll carry this with me forever." Years later, Caleb was deemed no longer a threat to himself or others and was released under strict supervision. He chose to remain in Colorado, dedicating his life to helping others who struggled with the weight of identity and loss. Through his work, he hoped to honor the love Andrew and Maggie had given him, even as he carried the burden of their deaths. What are your thoughts on the role of secrets within families? Could honesty have prevented this tragedy, or were the Beckett's intentions justified? Do you believe the jury's verdict was fair? Should Caleb have faced harsher consequences, or was his emotional state an adequate defense? How would you have handled this situation if you were in Caleb's shoes, or his parents'? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that explore the depths of human emotion and the complexities of morality.